Have you ever wondered what it's like to be born not out of love, but out of calculation? Imagine, every movement causes pain. Every morning begins with you being afraid of yourself. Now imagine that the cause of your suffering is not illness, a curse, or an accident, but a decision made long before you were born, a decision cloaked in gold, sanctified by the church and approved by monarchs. This is not fiction. This is reality, a reality in which the royal families of Europe have been intermarrying for centuries in pursuit of a pure dynasty, where family ties have become a closed loop, like a snake constricting itself, slowly suffocating each new generation. Your mother is your cousin, your father is your uncle, your grandmother is your aunt, and you are not a human being, but flesh created for the throne. Not for life, but for power. This is how kings were born. Emperors, princesses, not out of love, but out of incest. Not among the poor, but under the arches of palaces. Not in secret, but in full view of the world, because the European nobility sincerely believed that their blood was not just special, but holy, blessed by God Himself. And like all things holy, it had to be protected. From strangers, from commoners, from dirty alliances. The solution was simple. Marry within the family. First third cousins, and then it was just a short step to sisters. Thus the royal dynasties of Europe became laboratories. The experiment on genes lasted for centuries. Marriages were not based on desire, but on calculation. The family trees became so tangled that by the 10th century, most European royal houses were so intertwined that their genealogies resembled a spider's web rather than a tree. And in this web, every child was a knot, a prince who was simultaneously a nephew, a cousin, and an heir, a princess destined to marry her own uncle. But this perfect order came at a price, a genetic one. At first, there were slight abnormalities. Then came congenital diseases, deformities, infertility, and insanity. And it was women who suffered most often, those who were born to be chess pieces. Their bodies were broken. Their destinies were not their own. One such story began in the year 1634, in the cold halls of the Vienna Hofburg, amid heavy tapestries and the smell of medicine, a girl named Maria Anna of Austria was born. From her first breath, she was doomed. No servant dared to say it out loud, but everyone could see it. She was not just weak, she was sick to her very core. Her spine was so twisted that it looked as if it was trying to escape from her body. Her lower jaw protruded forward, and her lips could not close. Breathing was painful. Eating was almost impossible. Every meal was torture. Her food was ground into crumbs, but even then, every swallow caused pain. Other children laughed and ran around the garden, while Maria Anna sat by the window, quiet, hunched over, her eyes full of understanding. She realized early on that her illness was not a punishment from heaven. It was not fate. It was blood. The very blood that she had been told about with such pride, the blood of the Habsburgs, great and proud, which had been mixed with itself for centuries, mixed until it became poison. In every portrait hanging in the halls of the Viennese palace, Maria Anna recognizes herself. Her uncle has the same prominent chin, her grandmother has the same crooked back, her cousin has the same glassy, dull gaze. It's not a disease. It's family, it's heritage, a genetic chain where each subsequent link tightens the noose. The royal physicians, dressed in black robes, their hands covered in age spots, never tell the truth. They babble about God's providence, about punishment from above, but they avoid one word, the word that could dispel her guilt, incest. And yet she knows. And this knowledge becomes a burden heavier than any physical pain. She hardly ever leaves her dark room with its curtains drawn tight. The world outside the window is unattainable. Love is a privilege reserved for others. Her only consolation is books. She reads voraciously, devouring pages like breaths of air. Her mind is clear, hungry for knowledge, as if trying to escape from the body that has become her prison. In these books, there are other worlds, worlds where girls marry for love, not by decree, where children are born healthy, not with broken souls. But reality is unforgiving. Every month she is examined like a strange animal. Her jaw is measured, the curvature of her spine is recorded, new symptoms are noted. As if a restorer were describing how an old statue is crumbling, she reaches the age when royal daughters are given in marriage. But no one wants to see her as a wife. Even her cousins, accustomed to marriages between relatives, shy away. She remains unmarried, not of her own free will, but because she is considered useless. At 32, her body gives up. The official version is multiple illnesses. The real reason is the decisions of others. She was ruined by her ancestors, who valued power above compassion. The purity of blood was more important than human life. She was not killed by illness, but by her surname. But Maria Anna is just one of many. There is a name that has been uttered for centuries with regret and bewilderment, Juana la Loca. But maybe she wasn't crazy at all. Maybe she was just broken. Her story begins in 1479 in the Kingdom of Castile. She was the daughter of the legendary Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand, the very same who expelled the Jews and Muslims from Spain and gave money to Christopher Columbus. From childhood, Juana was intelligent, refined, and sensitive. She knew several languages, read philosophers, and played musical instruments. No one could have imagined that this girl would spend half a century imprisoned in a convent. But the roots of her tragedy lay in her blood. Isabella and Ferdinand were cousins. The bond that strengthened their political alliance destroyed their biological one. At 16, Juana was married to Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy. He was dazzlingly handsome, but cold, cunning, and cruel. She, raised in a spirit of obedience and maternal sacrifice, fell desperately in love with him. He cheated on her. She forgave him. He rejected her. She clung to him. When he died suddenly in 1506, Juana broke down, but not like a madwoman, like a woman abandoned by the whole world. She couldn't believe he was dead. She traveled around Castile with his coffin, opening the lid to kiss him, to touch him, to make sure. Horrific? Perhaps. But isn't that where true pain lies? Not in the cries of the soul that no one hears. Juana was declared insane. Her own father, Ferdinand, ordered her to be imprisoned in the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. Then, when Ferdinand died, her imprisonment was continued by his son, Charles V. 46 years, 46 winters and summers, in silence, without warmth, without light, without sympathy. She lived in cold chambers without a bathroom, without conversation. Her madness was convenient. It deprived her of her rights and eliminated the threat she posed. And perhaps it was not an illness. It was the same diagnosis that today sounds different: severe depression, anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. She was a woman who had been broken, first by marriage, then by betrayal, and then by silence. Witnesses described her screaming fits, days without food, long silences that were suddenly interrupted by bitter, animalistic crying. But the same people said other things. She prayed with sincere fervor, continued to read, and remembered her children with love. And if you look at her family tree, everything becomes clear. Her great-grandmother had similar episodes. Juana's daughter, Catherine of Aragon, also suffered from severe depression. This is no coincidence. It is a pattern, a line that cracked long before her. Today, many historians agree Juana was not insane, but a victim, a political victim. Her instability became the perfect excuse to keep her from power. While Europe was moving into a new era, Juana was fading away in solitude, in a convent cell disguised as a palace. She died in 1555, alone, forgotten, quietly buried, like an inconvenient memory. But in reality, she was a woman who loved too much, who was betrayed too deeply, and who paid not only for the ambitions of others, but also for the mistakes of a dynasty rotting from within. Juana was not insane. She was perfectly normal in a world that had long since gone mad. Madrid. The year is 1651. There's a celebration in the palace. A girl has been born. Pale, fragile, tiny. All around are ovations, fanfare, and solemn speeches. Artists sharpen their brushes. Heralds shout her name. Margarita Teresa of Austria, Princess of Spain. Her father is King Philip IV. Her mother is Maria Anna of Austria. And here's the main nuance. Maria Anna is not just his wife. She is his niece. Yes, his niece. By this point, the Habsburgs no longer married for alliance, only for blood. The same blood, poisoned but pure. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, generation after generation, until the DNA became a puzzle with incompatible pieces. From her earliest years, Margarita was not a child but a symbol. Velázquez painted her portraits as if they were icons, lavish dresses, heavy wigs, servants in the background. But if you look closer, something disturbing emerges from behind the lace. A protruding jaw, a hazy gaze, a tense posture. This is not style. These are symptoms, subtle signs of the very blood that breaks. She has no childhood. No one asks her what she wants. From an early age, she is told that she will become the wife of her uncle, Emperor Leopold I. The age of betrothal is 3. The age of marriage is 15. Her relationship to her fiancé. He is her father's brother, and no one sees anything wrong with this. Everyone calls it a great diplomatic triumph. But Margarita herself grows up feeling that her body does not belong to her, that she is not a person, but a tool. Her duty is to give birth to a healthy heir. Although everyone understands that with such a legacy, this is almost impossible. At 15, she is sent to Vienna. At 16, she is already pregnant. Her first child, a girl, dies shortly after birth. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage. The third is a long-awaited son. He survives, but very soon he also begins to show physical abnormalities. And Margarita is getting weaker. Her body can't cope. Each new child seems to tear a piece of her soul away. The court doctors meticulously record everything: speech difficulties, convulsions, refusal to eat, attacks of suffocation. But no one mentions the real reason. No one utters the word that explains everything: incest. It is easier for them to blame it all on a strange fever than to admit the price of their policies. At the age of 21, Margarita dies. Officially, she died of an infection. In reality, she died from a body that had been broken since birth, but was forced to fulfill the duties of a queen. The most terrible thing about her death is not the fact of her death itself. It is the reason why she was mourned. The court mourned not for the girl, not for the daughter of the empire, but for a broken machine, for the loss of a womb that could no longer give them children. The child empress was sacrificed on the altar of power, and no one apologized. Anne of Austria was not born for the crown. She was born to be subjugated. She was born in 1501 to King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, another union between uncle and niece. The girl's fate was sealed from her first cry. She was raised as a pawn, as a future political treaty. At the age of 14, she was sent to France to be married to King Louis XIII. The girl, who did not know the language, found herself in a hostile, cold environment where every smile could hide intrigue and every glance could hide suspicion. Her husband was withdrawn, sullen, and emotionally broken. Modern historians believe that he suffered from severe depression and hidden homosexuality. In those days, such things were not talked about. They were hidden. Anne became a queen without a voice. Her role was reduced to one thing: to give birth to an heir. Years passed, but she did not conceive. Rumors multiplied. The French nobility whispered that the marriage was cursed, that God had turned away. Doctors looked at her and saw no reason, even though it was right in front of their eyes: her overly prominent jaw, fragile health, weak voice. But instead of acknowledging genetic degradation, she was treated with mercury, leeches, and absurd diets, as if she were not a woman, but a barren mare. Anna remained silent. She endured. Every day was a struggle with anxiety, humiliation, and loneliness. She began to fear people. She developed an extreme form of anxiety disorder, what we now call agoraphobia. She never left her room, hiding behind curtains as if they were a shield. Meanwhile, Louis almost stopped showing up. They lived like neighbors who happened to be in the same cage. Years passed. Anne grew old without fulfilling her main function. And then suddenly, a miracle happened. After 23 years of marriage, she gave birth to a son, Louis XIV, the future Sun King. France rejoiced. But for Anne, this was not a relief, but the beginning of new pressure. They expected her to repeat the feat, a second child, a backup for the dynasty, and she became pregnant again. But her body, already weak, began to break down. Digestive problems, attacks of suffocation, constant pain, days when she could not get out of bed. The courtiers who had previously ignored her now showered her with honors, not out of respect, but out of gratitude for her offspring. In the last years of her life, Anna increasingly turned to faith. She prayed for hours. She fell into religious fanaticism. She sought there the comfort that neither her husband, nor her doctors, nor her courtiers had given her. She died in 1666. Her mission was accomplished. She had given the world a great king. And she herself remained only a shadow, emaciated, forgotten. She was not remembered as a person, only as a womb in a crown. Her story is living proof of what a woman becomes when she is reduced to the role of an incubator for the sake of a dynasty. When we hear the name Marie Antoinette, images come to mind: powder, wigs, cakes, balls, Versailles in all its luxury and madness. But behind the veil of lace was reality. A teenager born with blood on her hands, scarred by centuries of incest. She was born in 1755. She was the daughter of Empress Maria Teresa and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Their union was not as close as others, but their family trees had been intertwined for generations. The blood had long since shown signs of degeneration. From early childhood, Marie Antoinette knew that she was not a girl, but a diplomatic currency. At the age of 14, she was sent to France to marry the future Louis XVI, a girl, forced to become a queen. In portraits, Marie Antoinette looks dazzling, almost otherworldly. But if you look closer, you can see the Habsburg legacy: the slightly protruding lower lip, the massive jaw, the shadow of an inexplicable sadness in her eyes. These are not just facial features. They are traces of degeneration accumulated over centuries of intermarriage. Her body was home not only to the genes of emperors, but also to pain, severe hormonal imbalances, excruciating menstruation, miscarriages, and constant anxiety that haunted her until the end of her life. Her marriage was a union of two fragile beings, breaking under the weight of their crowns. Louis XVI suffered from social awkwardness, emotional coldness, and possibly late sexual development. For 7 years, their marriage remained imperfect. 7 years of humiliation. 7 years during which all of France relished the rumors. And as always, the woman was blamed. Doctors examined her body as if it were a broken machine and could not understand. It was not her fault. It was the fault of two broken bodies trying to appear normal. When Marie Antoinette finally became pregnant, a real nightmare began. Toxicity with incessant vomiting, anxiety attacks, severe depression, which today would be diagnosed as prenatal depression. Her first daughter was born healthy, but then came a series of tragedies, stillbirths, infant deaths, tears frozen on velvet pillows. Each miscarriage became a public failure, a blow to her status as queen. But the real hell began later. France erupted. People were hungry, angry, and enraged, and Marie Antoinette became the perfect target. Her dresses, diamonds, and feasts were all presented as symbols of the decaying Versailles. She was even credited with a phrase she most likely never uttered: "Let them eat cake." These words became a metaphor for everything the common people wanted to hate. But behind this colorful facade was a broken girl who simply did not know how to survive the coming hell. Witnesses at court noticed her sudden mood swings. Outbursts of excitement were followed by weeks of withdrawal, impulsive actions, prolonged silences. Today, psychiatrists would call it severe anxiety and depression, symptoms born not of weakness of character, but of a distorted family history. During her trial, she conducted herself with remarkable dignity, but her speech was confused. She lost her train of thought. Her gaze wandered. She increasingly zoned out. Her mind could no longer cope. On October 16, 1793, she was executed. She was 37 years old. Her head rolled into a basket, and with it collapsed an entire dynasty that for decades had refused to admit that it was destroying itself. It was not only the queen who died. A woman broken from within, a victim of genetics and other people's decisions, died. Marie Antoinette is not just a symbol of frivolity. She is a girl forced to grow up under the yoke of diplomacy, a wife forced into a dysfunctional union, a mother who buried her own children, and above all, a woman who was never allowed to simply be a woman. But if the consequences of royal incest manifested themselves in their most monstrous form, it was in the Alcazar of Madrid, in the heart of Spain, at the twilight of the Habsburg dynasty. Here, in luxurious but gloomy halls, lived the infantas, the daughters, nieces, and granddaughters of Charles II, the most damaged monarch in Europe. Genetic analysis conducted after the fact showed that Charles's inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. He was sterile, suffered from epilepsy, was mentally deficient, had stomach problems, and severe skull deformities. But he was not alone. His sisters, cousins, and nieces, those very same little infants, were just the same. They wore velvet and pearls, but their bodies were literally falling apart. One of them, Maria Margarita, was born in 1651. She was unable to speak coherently for 7 years. She walked with difficulty and fell all the time. She had panic attacks and flashes of fear that no one knew the name for, but she was still taken to receptions like a porcelain doll with a frozen smile, because, like all the women in this story, she was not herself. She was a showcase. Sad, fragile, doomed. Today, doctors would most likely diagnose her with autism, but back then she was simply called capricious and weak. Maria Teresa, another infanta, suffered from constant seizures. At the time it was called falling sickness, but we know what it was: epilepsy. Her spine was so curved that she could not sit without support. Her jaw prevented her from chewing. She ate only liquid food, broths, and decoctions. And yet, despite her obvious problems, she continued to be considered a valuable bride. Because even crippled, even sick, even mentally disabled, they were carriers of royal blood. And in the eyes of European courts, blood was worth more than health, happiness, or common sense. Court physicians kept meticulous records. Pages of reports describing deformities, fevers, and nervous seizures, but not with the aim of helping. It was as if they were talking about breeding animals. The Alcazar in Madrid in those years was more like a hospital than a palace. Princesses were raised there like failed biological projects. Surrounded by doctors, surgeons, and confessors, the infant princesses lived under constant observation. They were corrected, they were tested, they were studied, but they were not loved. And yet the marriage deals continued. Maria Margarita, with her unstable mind and emaciated body, was married off to her own cousin, Emperor Leopold VIII, the same man who had previously been married to Margarita Teresa, the girl empress, who died at the age of 21. Maria Margarita's marriage was a disaster. She did not fully understand what it meant to be a wife. Her mental development remained at the level of a child. Her wedding night was torture, both physical and psychological. And then the familiar nightmare began. She was expected to have children. No one heard her fear. No one noticed her tears. No one said, "Enough." Pregnancy was seen as a death sentence. Women's letters from that time reveal the true extent of their suffering. Children were born with such deformities that they died within hours. Mothers held them in their arms and watched as life slipped away before it had even begun. They prayed to God never to become pregnant again, and each one prayed in silence, consumed by guilt. They believed they were to blame, but they were victims of an endless experiment disguised as royal policy, blessed by the church, signed with seals. Their bodies suffered, but their souls suffered even more. They hid from mirrors, from people, from themselves. Many left this life without ever hearing the words, "You are a human being," because to everyone else they were only one thing, princesses, and that meant they were prisoners of their own family name. Until now, we have told the stories of women, personal, tragic, terrible stories. But behind each of them lies not only fate, but the harsh, merciless law of biology, which was deliberately ignored. When two blood relatives, cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters, have children, the genetic risk increases exponentially. Why? Because each of us carries mutated, damaged genes. Usually this is not a big deal. The other parent provides a healthy copy. But if both parents are from the same family, there is a high probability that they carry the same defect. And then the child receives two damaged genes. The result? Disease, deformities, mental disorders, infertility, seizures, depression, autism. And this list is repeated from generation to generation. This phenomenon is called inbreeding depression. The Habsburg family is the most famous and tragic example of this phenomenon in human history. The Habsburg jaw, which many consider an exotic feature, is actually a progressive mutation. With each new marriage between relatives, the bone protruded more and more. In some family members, the jaw protruded so far forward that they could not close their mouths. They couldn't chew solid food, but that was only on the outside. The worst was inside, what couldn't be seen, what had been destroying them since birth. Autoimmune disorders, immunodeficiencies, neurological abnormalities, chronic anxiety, severe depression. Everything that used to be called women's whims or melancholy turned out to be a genetic sentence caused by centuries of close-kin marriages, miscarriages, babies dying within hours of birth, infertility of queens. All of this was written in their DNA. But the court did not notice this, or did not want to notice. Court physicians kept meticulous diaries. They saw recurring symptoms, traced patterns, wrote about hereditary diseases and congenital infertility. But no one tried to stop the cycle. Health gave way to dynasty. Personality was a surname, and power did not tolerate mixing. Yes, even the church, the very institution that could have stood in the way of this madness, issued papal indulgences, special permissions for marriages between uncles and nieces, between first cousins, because as they said, the blood of kings is sacred. God's will was to keep it pure, but in reality, they were keeping control. Mixing with commoners was a weakness, and power could not be weak. So the blood of kings turned into poison, not metaphorical, real poison. It disfigured bodies, broke minds, destroyed lives. And none of this was an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system, created deliberately, maintained with cold calculation and brutal consistency. The archives are full of warnings, medical reports, lists of symptoms, alarming conclusions. But no one paid attention because a surname was worth more than a human life. And the royal palaces were not refuges, but laboratories, where girls were not protected, but studied, not loved, but used, and in the end, discarded. But the monarchs were not alone. The Catholic Church, with its enormous moral influence, could have said, "This is a sin. This is dangerous. It's inhumane." But it chose to remain silent. What's more, it encouraged it. By granting kings permission to marry within the family, it did not preserve holy blood. It preserved the levers of power. Because a monarchy mixed with the people is no longer a monarchy, and the threat to power could not be allowed. The most bitter irony is that sometimes it was women who continued the destructive tradition. Queens, princesses, empresses, raised in castles, taught to revere their blood as something divine. They believed that preserving the dynasty meant marrying their cousin, their uncle, their nephew, that their bodies were something public, intended not for them, but for the dynasty. And when another dead child was born, they blamed themselves. They did not know genetics. They did not know that the problem was not with them, but with the system itself, with the iron rules from which there was no escape. And so the cycle continued. Women raised in obedience and pain repeated the path of their mothers. They hoped, this time will be different. This time a healthy child will be born. This time God will hear us. But every time it happened again. And somewhere deep down, they knew it. They knew, but they continued. Because the castle walls were stronger than their doubts. Because their family name carried more weight than the truth. Now that we have walked this path, through their scarred bodies, through their minds destroyed by fear, through their lives cut short too soon, it is time to ask the main question, not a historical one, but a human one. Did any of this make sense? Maria Anna, Juana, Margarita Teresa, Anne of Austria, Marie Antoinette. The little infants, they weren't just royal blood. They weren't just symptoms in medical journals, and they certainly weren't just lines in genealogical tables. They were daughters, wives, mothers, girls, living people who found themselves trapped in a system that treated them like pawns on a genetic chessboard. They did not choose their fate. They did not decide who they would be betrothed to. They did not ask to give birth to sick children. They did not seek isolation, humiliation, or loneliness. But they paid the full price for the ambitions of those who lived before them. And yet, their pain was not in vain. Thanks to medical and court chronicles describing their lives, science began to understand the basics of genetics. Doctors who had previously observed only inexplicable symptoms began to see patterns: deformed jaws, neurological diseases, hereditary infertility, mental disorders. All of this was repeated from generation to generation, like an ominous echo. Research on the Habsburg dynasty became the basis for future discoveries. It was these tragedies that allowed science to realize the dangers of inbreeding. Today we understand how recessive genes work. We know that genetic diversity is not a threat, but a vital necessity for human health. The price was terrible, but the lesson was invaluable. Nevertheless, the threat has not disappeared. In some closed communities around the world, for religious, cultural, or traditional reasons, consanguineous marriages are still practiced, and with them come the same risks. History repeats itself when it is forgotten. But perhaps the most important thing these stories give us is not scientific knowledge, but a deeply human awareness. Because it was not only genetic degeneration that destroyed these women. They were broken by dehumanization. They were not seen as individuals. They were seen as walking wombs, as tools of diplomacy, as useful bodies. They were locked up for not giving birth. They were forced to carry deadly pregnancies to term. They were denied the right to fear, to dream, to speak. This was not the past. It was a system. And unfortunately, it is still alive today. Even today, millions of women around the world suffer in silence under the weight of expectations from their families, religion, society, husbands. The echoes of broken infants resound in every girl who has been denied the right to choose, in every mother who blames herself for not being able to save her child, in every woman who has been reduced to a function, a duty, biology. That is why these stories need to be told, not as royal scandals, not as medical curiosities, but as warnings, as living memory, as a reminder of the price people pay when power becomes more important than life. If we ever start justifying suffering in the name of tradition, family name, or ideology again, then we must return to these women. Look into their eyes in their portraits. Hear the silence filled with pain. And remember, they deserved better. They deserved love, health, freedom, the right to choose, the right to live. Their blood was considered sacred, and their souls were considered trash. But today, their voices, once silenced, are breaking through the centuries with one last request. Remember us, not for our crowns, but for who we were, women, who should never have suffered for the decisions of others.